Beneath the tobacco fields of colonial Maryland, nestled among the rolling hills of an Arundel County, a secret so unsettling lies buried that the Catholic Church has spent more than 2 centuries attempting to wipe it from the historical record. From 1734 to 1768, a single family seized control of 12 parishes across the colony, a family whose name still compels elderly parishioners to cross themselves in dread. The Thornton family didn't merely serve God. They impersonated him, twisting the holy act of confession into a weapon of terror that would make today's organized crime look like amateur mischief. What you're about to hear has been assembled from sealed church archives, coded journals unearthed inside a Maryland farmhouse wall in 1892, and testimonies that remained buried for nearly 3 centuries. This is no ordinary tale of religious wrongdoing. This is the account of how 3 men weaponized the confessional booth to dominate an entire colony through blackmail, poison, and the most grotesque betrayal of sacred trust ever recorded in American history. Before we go further into the story of the Thornton family and their web of ecclesiastical horror, I need to pause and ask you something. This channel isn't meant for everyone, only for the boldest souls willing to dig up the dark secrets that history fought to keep buried. If you're one of those rare individuals with the courage to hear these forbidden stories, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I'd love to know, drop a comment below telling me what city or state you're joining us from. Are you daring enough to reveal your location as we plunge into this darkness together? Now, let's go back to Maryland, 1734, where evil dressed itself in a priest's collar. The autumn of 1734 found colonial Maryland in a delicate position, caught between Protestant and Catholic tensions, a religious battleground where the Calvert family's Catholic influence still held ground despite mounting Anglican pressure. In this volatile climate, the small port town of Havenwood, tucked along the Severn River roughly 20 miles southeast of Annapolis, represented everything the Catholic Church was struggling to protect in the New World. Havenwood was modest by colonial standards, perhaps 800 souls scattered across tobacco plantations and the small businesses that supplied them. But what it lacked in size, it compensated for in power. The town's Catholic families held enormous sway over the tobacco trade flowing through the Chesapeake Bay, their names appearing on shipping manifests stretching from London to the Caribbean. The Curthers possessed 3 plantations and a fleet of merchant vessels. The Whitmore family commanded the largest tobacco warehouse between Baltimore and Annapolis. The Ashfords had amassed their fortune through both tobacco and the less openly discussed but enormously lucrative slave trade. At the center of this Catholic enclave stood St. Bartholomew's Church, a modest brick structure whose bell tower was visible to ships entering the Severn River. Unlike the towering cathedrals of Europe, St. Bartholomew reflected the practical instincts of colonial architecture: sturdy oak pews, plain glass windows, and thick walls built to withstand Maryland's humid summers and the occasional raid by pirates who still prowled the Chesapeake. But it was what existed within those walls that would render St. Bartholomew infamous. In the late summer of 1734, Father Thomas Thornton arrived to serve as the parish priest, accompanied by an unusual request. He wanted to install new confessional booths, not just 1 or 2, but 4 elaborately crafted wooden chambers that he claimed would more effectively serve the spiritual needs of his expanding congregation. Father Thornton was nothing like what most parishioners had anticipated in a priest. Tall and commanding at nearly 6 feet, with prematurely gray hair and piercing blue eyes, he carried an intelligence that felt almost predatory. He spoke with the polished accent of someone trained in European seminaries, yet there was something in his bearing that suggested he grasped the raw realities of colonial life better than most men of the cloth. When he smiled, which he did frequently during those early months, it never extended to his eyes. What the congregation of St. Bartholomew didn't realize was that Father Thornton had spent the previous 5 years traveling throughout Maryland, visiting Catholic parishes and carefully cataloging their wealthiest and most influential members. He had scrutinized their business dealings, their family ties, their strengths, and, most critically, their potential weaknesses. He hadn't come to Havenwood to save souls. He had come to harvest secrets. The confessional booths Father Thornton installed were masterworks of deceptive craftsmanship, constructed by his nephew Marcus, a gifted carpenter who had supposedly honed his skills in Philadelphia. Each booth appeared to be a standard 3-chambered confessional, a central compartment for the priest flanked by 2 kneeling chambers for penitents. The dark oak construction and intricately carved crosses lent them an air of sacred gravity that impressed even the wealthiest parishioners. But concealed within the walls of each confessional was an innovation that would have appalled the faithful had they ever found it. Marcus Thornton had built a series of hollow metal tubes running from each penitent chamber down to a hidden recording room beneath the church. These tubes, fashioned from tin and carefully angled to carry sound without distortion, allowed every whispered confession to be heard and transcribed in the basement below. The recording system itself was ingeniously straightforward. The metal tubes fed into small echo chambers lined with curved metallic surfaces that amplified sound. A person stationed in the basement could hear conversations from the confessionals overhead with remarkable clarity. But Father Thornton went a step further still. He trained his younger nephew Samuel to transcribe those conversations using a personal cipher, generating permanent records of every confession spoken at St. Bartholomew. The Thornton family's first victim revealed himself on a cold February morning in 1735, though he had no idea he was walking into a trap 6 months in the making. Richard Whitmore entered Street Bartholomew that Tuesday morning carrying a burden that had been gnawing at him for weeks. As one of Havenwood's most prosperous tobacco merchants, Whitmore was known throughout the colony for his rigid adherence to Catholic doctrine and his generous contributions to the church. His reputation rested on integrity, honest dealing, and the kind of moral uprightness that led other merchants to seek him out as a business partner. But Richard Whitmore concealed a secret that would have dismantled everything he had constructed. 3 months earlier, while conducting business in Annapolis, Whitmore had encountered a young woman named Catherine Mills, an indentured servant working at the tavern where he frequently lodged on business trips. Catherine was 19, beautiful in the way that made men forget their vows, and bound by an indenture contract that wouldn't expire for another 4 years. What had begun as idle conversation had developed into something that Catholic doctrine regarded as one of the gravest of sins, adultery. As Whitmore knelt in the confessional that February morning, his voice barely above a whisper, he poured his guilt out before Father Thornton. He spoke of his shame, his betrayal of his wife Margaret, his violation of his sacred marriage vows. He described his continuing relationship with Catherine, his intention to purchase her indenture contract, and his terror that the affair would surface and shatter his family's reputation. Father Thornton listened with the practiced compassion of a seasoned confessor, extending words of comfort and assuring Whitmore that God's forgiveness was available to all who truly repented. He prescribed a penance of prayers and charitable donations, then blessed Whitmore as the merchant left the confessional with tears of relief streaming down his face. But in the basement beneath Street Bartholomew, Samuel Thornton had transcribed every word of Whitmore's confession, encoding it in the cipher his uncle had taught him. The young man's handwriting was precise as he recorded details that would soon be turned into weapons. Catherine Mills, indentured servant at the Brass Lantern Tavern in Annapolis. Contract holder Jonathan Pierce. Relationship ongoing since November 1734. Whitmore plans to purchase indenture within the month. The transformation of this sacred confession into an instrument of blackmail began exactly 1 week later. Father Thornton requested a private meeting with Whitmore, claiming he needed to address a matter of urgent spiritual importance. They met in the priest's study on a Thursday evening, the room lit only by candles that sent flickering shadows across walls lined with theological texts. "Richard," Father Thornton began, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed entirely genuine. "I've been praying deeply about our conversation last week, and God has shown me a path that might ease your burden." Whitmore leaned forward eagerly, his face full of hope that his spiritual advisor had discovered a solution to his moral crisis. "The church faces significant expenses in the coming months," Father Thornton continued. "We are planning to broaden our charitable works, perhaps establish a fund to assist indentured servants in difficult circumstances, particularly young women who find themselves in vulnerable situations." The priest's pause was perfectly timed, allowing the implications to settle before he went on. "I believe God is calling you to make a substantial contribution to this fund, perhaps £50 initially, with monthly donations of £10 thereafter. This would demonstrate the sincerity of your repentance while helping others who may find themselves in situations not unlike Miss Mills." The color drained from Whitmore's face as the full weight of what had just occurred landed on him. Father Thornton had not only retained every detail of his confession but was now deploying that sacred information to demand money. The priest's charitable expression never faltered, but Whitmore could see something cold and calculated lurking behind those blue eyes. "Father, our conversation was under the seal of confession." "And it remains so," Father Thornton replied smoothly. "I would never violate that sacred trust. But God communicates with me through many channels, Richard, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through divine revelation. He has made known to me your desire to help young Catherine, and I am simply offering you a sanctified way to direct that charitable impulse." Whitmore sat in stunned silence, his merchant's mind rapidly calculating the implications. £50 was a considerable sum, but manageable. The monthly £10 would be more demanding, but not impossible. The alternative, having his affair exposed, would obliterate his marriage, his business relationships, and his standing in the community. And if I were to contribute to this charitable fund, then I believe God would bless your discretion in all your personal affairs, Father Thornton replied. The church has always been a sanctuary for those seeking to live righteous lives, away from the prying eyes of gossips and busybodies. Whitmore agreed to the payments, convincing himself that he was genuinely performing an act of charity that might help other young women in difficult situations. He had no way of knowing he was the first of what would eventually become hundreds of victims, or that his confession had served as the test case for a blackmail operation that would spread across Maryland like a pestilence. That night, as Whitmore walked home through Havenwood's quiet streets, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind. He couldn't shake the sense that his life had fundamentally shifted, that he had crossed some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. Behind him, the bell tower of St. Bartholomew rose against the star-filled sky like a dark finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. The success of the Whitmore extortion persuaded Father Thornton that his system was not merely viable but potentially far more lucrative than he had initially envisioned. Over the following months, he began executing the second phase of his plan, a methodical expansion that would ultimately reshape the religious landscape of colonial Maryland into his personal criminal dominion. The foundation of this expansion lay in Father Thornton's two nephews, both of whom had been carefully molded for their roles in the family operation. Marcus, the elder at 28, possessed the technical expertise required to build the modified confessionals, while Samuel, barely 21, had been trained since childhood in the craft of transcription and ciphering. But what made the Thornton scheme truly diabolical was that both young men were legitimately ordained priests, having completed their seminary education in Baltimore under their uncle's guidance and financial backing. By the spring of 1735, Father Thornton had secured appointments for his nephews at 2 additional parishes. Marcus was assigned to St. Michael's in the port town of Easton, while Samuel assumed control of the struggling parish of St. Joseph's in the tobacco-growing region near Chestertown. Each appointment came accompanied by the same request, permission to install new confessional booths to better serve their congregations. The expansion strategy was methodical and unhurried. Rather than attempting to blackmail every parishioner who revealed a secret, the Thorntons concentrated on what they called productive sins, transgressions committed by individuals with both the financial resources to pay substantial sums and the social standing that made exposure genuinely catastrophic. Adultery was ideal, but they also pursued embezzlement, tax evasion, illegal business practices, and the various forms of corruption endemic to colonial commerce. Their communication system was as sophisticated as their confessional modifications. Using a web of merchant contacts and traveling salesmen, the 3 priests maintained regular correspondence through coded letters that appeared to address routine church business while actually relaying detailed intelligence about potential victims and their vulnerabilities. A letter describing a spiritual awakening among tobacco farmers might actually be reporting that several plantation owners had confessed to cheating on their taxes. A request for additional prayer books for the Women's Society could contain coded instructions identifying which wealthy widow had confessed to an affair with her overseer. By the close of 1735, the Thornton network was drawing substantial income from 12 regular victims across 3 parishes. Richard Whitmore remained their most dependable source, his monthly payments having climbed to £15 as Father Thornton claimed the church's charitable needs had expanded. But the Whitmore case had also taught the Thorntons a vital lesson about managing their victims' psychology. Rather than simply demanding payment in exchange for silence, Father Thornton had devised a sophisticated justification system that allowed his victims to preserve their self-respect while paying extortion. The money was always framed as charitable donations, penance contributions, or payments toward specific church projects. Victims were encouraged to see themselves as generous benefactors rather than blackmail targets, a psychological manipulation that significantly reduced the likelihood of rebellion or desperate measures. The system's effectiveness was demonstrated most vividly in the case of Edmund Curthers, the prosperous plantation owner whose shipping enterprise dominated much of the Chesapeake Bay trade. Curthers had confessed to systematically underreporting his cargo manifests to avoid paying full customs duties required by the Crown, a practice that, while widespread, was technically treason and punishable by the seizure of all his assets. When Father Thornton approached Curthers about making a substantial contribution to the church's mission among the poor, the plantation owner initially pushed back. But the priest's gentle suggestion that, God sees all our commercial dealings, even those conducted in the shadows of the customs house, was sufficient to secure Curthers' cooperation. Within 6 months, Curthers was contributing £25 monthly to what he believed was a fund supporting impoverished Catholic families throughout Maryland. The psychological toll on the victims grew more apparent as the months accumulated. Richard Whitmore, once celebrated for his cheerful demeanor and social ease, became progressively withdrawn and anxious. He began attending Mass daily rather than weekly, as though excessive piety might somehow tip the scales of his guilt. His wife Margaret noticed the transformation but attributed it to business pressures and her husband's deepening religious devotion. Edmund Curthers developed different symptoms. Always a meticulous record keeper, he became consumed by his business documents, spending hours each evening reviewing manifests and correspondence as though searching for some hidden error or oversight. His slaves reported that he would sometimes jolt awake in the middle of the night and insist on personally inspecting cargo that had already been checked multiple times. But the most disturbing transformation unfolded within the parishes themselves. The Thornton priests had cultivated an atmosphere of spiritual intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Their sermons dwelt heavily on themes of concealed sin, divine punishment, and the absolute necessity of honesty before God. They pushed frequent confession, sometimes insinuating that parishioners who went more than a week without confessing their sins were gambling with eternal damnation. This spiritual pressure created a feedback loop that fed directly into the blackmail apparatus. Parishioners terrified of harboring unconfessed sins began revealing not only their major transgressions but also minor indiscretions, inappropriate thoughts, and business dealings that might not have been entirely above board. The Thorntons' confession record swelled with intelligence about colonial Maryland's elite, assembling a comprehensive archive of secrets that would have been invaluable to any criminal enterprise. By early 1736, Father Thornton was prepared to launch the third phase of his plan, a sweeping expansion that would extend his network throughout Maryland and potentially into neighboring colonies. He had identified 16 additional parishes where his methods could be replicated, and he had begun recruiting additional family members and trusted associates who could be trained to operate confession recording systems. But the expansion would require overcoming a formidable obstacle. The Catholic Church's hierarchy in Baltimore had started to notice the unusual construction projects being undertaken by the Thornton priests. Bishop Carroll had specifically questioned the necessity of such elaborate confessional installations in relatively small parishes, and there were whispers that he was considering conducting formal inspections of churches where new confessionals had been erected. The solution Father Thornton devised would prove to be both his greatest triumph and the seed of his eventual downfall. It involved a degree of corruption so profound that it would ultimately threaten the very foundations of Catholic authority in colonial Maryland, and it would require the Thorntons to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. The winter of 1736 delivered an unexpected crisis that would test the resilience of the Thornton network and lay bare the true depths of their commitment to their criminal enterprise. A young woman named Isabella Ashford, daughter of one of Havenwood's most distinguished Catholic families, had begun to sense that something was deeply wrong with the confessions she was making at St. Bartholomew. Isabella was 19, endowed with the kind of sharp intellect that colonial society typically squandered on women but could never entirely suppress. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke fluent French and Latin, and had cultivated an almost scholarly fascination with Catholic theology through years of reading her father's religious texts. This education would prove to be Father Thornton's first serious miscalculation. The previous autumn, Isabella had confessed to Father Thornton that she had been secretly reading books the Church considered inappropriate for unmarried women, specifically several philosophical treatises that challenged traditional religious authority. It was a minor transgression by colonial standards, but Father Thornton had recognized an opening to establish control over the Ashford family fortune. Within 2 weeks of her confession, Isabella noticed that Father Thornton had begun weaving pointed references to young women who contaminate their minds with dangerous ideas into his Sunday sermons. When he requested a private meeting with her father to discuss concerns about the spiritual welfare of young people in the parish, Isabella's suspicions crystallized into something approaching certainty. But Isabella Ashford was not the kind of person to simply suspect, she was determined to investigate. Using skills she had refined through years of scholarly study, Isabella began conducting a systematic analysis of Father Thornton's behavioral patterns. She noted which parishioners were summoned to private meetings with the priest and attempted to correlate these meetings with their previous confessions. She observed which families had abruptly increased their charitable donations to the church and tried to determine what they might have confessed to inspire such sudden generosity. Most critically, Isabella began testing her theory through carefully controlled experiments. She confessed different fabricated sins to Father Thornton, claiming she had pilfered small items from local merchants, pretending she had entertained improper thoughts about married men, even inventing a story about secretly reading Protestant religious texts borrowed from Anglican neighbors. In each instance, Isabella watched attentively for signs that Father Thornton was using her confessions to manipulate her family's behavior. When she confessed to borrowing a silk handkerchief from Whitmore's general store, Father Thornton's next sermon featured pointed references to those who take what doesn't belong to them, even in small matters. When she invented a romantic interest in a married tobacco merchant, the priest began counseling her father about the importance of finding Isabella a suitable husband before her natural feminine weaknesses led her into temptation. But the experiment that fully convinced Isabella she was dealing with something far more sinister involved a deliberate fabrication about her family's business practices. She confessed to Father Thornton that she had overheard her father discussing plans to evade customs duties on a shipment of European goods by falsely declaring the cargo as religious materials exempt from taxation. This confession was pure invention. Isabella's father was scrupulously honest in his dealings. Yet within days, Father Thornton had requested a private meeting with James Ashford to discuss the spiritual implications of certain business practices that might compromise a man's standing before God. Isabella came to the horrifying realization that Father Thornton was systematically converting sacred confessions into tools of blackmail. But her investigation also uncovered something even more disturbing. The operation appeared to extend far beyond St. Bartholomew's Parish. Through discreet inquiries among her social connections in Annapolis and Baltimore, Isabella discovered that several other Catholic parishes had recently installed elaborate new confessional booths. When she mentioned the names of the priests involved, Marcus and Samuel Thornton, a pattern began to take shape suggesting a coordinated criminal enterprise operating beneath the cover of religious authority. Armed with this intelligence, Isabella made a decision that would have been unthinkable for most colonial women. She resolved to confront Father Thornton directly. She requested a private meeting under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance about her upcoming engagement to Jonathan Pierce, a young merchant from Annapolis her parents had selected as a suitable match. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday evening in late February 1737, in Father Thornton's study adjacent to the church sanctuary. Father Thornton welcomed Isabella with his customary show of fatherly warmth, offering tea and expressing his pleasure at her family's happiness over the engagement. But Isabella had not come for pleasantries. "Father Thornton," she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to say. "I have reason to believe that you have been violating the sacred seal of confession for purposes of financial extortion." The priest's benevolent expression never wavered, but Isabella detected a subtle shift in his posture, a faint tensing that told her the accusation had found its mark. "My dear child," Father Thornton replied with gentle concern, "I fear that your approaching marriage, and the natural anxieties it brings, may be giving you troubled thoughts. Perhaps we should address these concerns in the context of confession, where I can offer you proper spiritual guidance." "I have no intention of confessing anything to you," Isabella responded firmly. "Instead, I want you to explain why your sermons consistently echo the specific sins that parishioners have confided to you privately. I want you to explain why families who confess certain types of transgressions subsequently receive requests for increased charitable donations. And I want you to explain the unusual construction of your confessional booths." Father Thornton's mask of priestly concern finally slipped, exposing something cold and calculating beneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet menace that Isabella recognized as confirmation of her worst fears. "Miss Ashford, I fear you have developed some very dangerous ideas, the kind that could bring great distress to your family if they became widely known. Perhaps it would be wiser for you to focus on preparing for your marriage and leave theological matters to those with proper training." Isabella rose to leave, but Father Thornton's next words stopped her at the door. "I trust this conversation will remain between us. Your family carries such a sterling reputation in this community. It would be tragic if that reputation were damaged by unfounded accusations against a servant of God." As Isabella walked home through Havenwood's dark streets, she understood that she had not only confirmed her suspicions about Father Thornton's criminal activities but had also made herself a target. The priest's parting words had been an unmistakable threat: cooperate with his schemes or face consequences that could obliterate her family's standing. But Isabella Ashford had not spent years studying philosophy and theology only to be intimidated by a corrupt priest. She had a plan that would either expose the Thornton network entirely, or result in her own destruction. And she was prepared to accept either outcome in the name of justice. Isabella's plan demanded resources, allies, and a degree of discretion that would test even her formidable intelligence. She had identified the crime, confirmed the method, and confronted one of the perpetrators. Now she needed proof compelling enough to persuade the Catholic Church's hierarchy to act against the Thornton network, and she needed it before Father Thornton could set whatever retaliation he was planning into motion. The key to gathering evidence lay in gaining entry to the basement chamber beneath Street Bartholomew, where she suspected the confession recording system was housed. Isabella had studied the church's architecture over years of regular attendance, noticing several anomalies that now carried sinister significance: a door in the basement always kept locked, unusual acoustic qualities in the nave suggesting concealed chambers, and the fact that Father Thornton frequently disappeared for extended stretches during periods when no services were scheduled. Her opportunity arrived during the annual Lenten retreat in March 1737, when most of the parish would be attending special services at the cathedral in Annapolis. Father Thornton had announced that Street Bartholomew would be closed for cleaning and maintenance during the 3-day retreat, giving Isabella the access she needed to conduct her investigation. But first she needed to neutralize the risk that Father Thornton might discover her activities and carry out his threatened retaliation against her family. Isabella's solution demonstrated a quality of strategic thinking that would have drawn admiration from military commanders of the era. She composed a detailed letter documenting her suspicions about the Thornton network, including specific examples of correlations between confessions and subsequent sermons, the unusual construction of the confessional booths, and Father Thornton's implicit threats during their private meeting. She produced multiple copies and arranged for them to be delivered to Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, the governor of Maryland, and her cousin Thomas Ashford, who served as a magistrate in Annapolis, should anything happen to her. The letters were placed with a trusted family servant, with strict instructions to deliver them immediately if Isabella failed to retrieve them by a certain date, or if any harm came to her or her family. This dead man's switch effectively eliminated Father Thornton's ability to retaliate without triggering a full-scale investigation. With this protection in place, Isabella proceeded with her infiltration of St. Bartholomew's basement on the second night of the Lenten retreat. She had obtained keys to the church through her friendship with Margaret Whitmore, who served as the church's volunteer caretaker and had access to the building for cleaning purposes. What Isabella found in the basement exceeded even her most dire expectations. The locked chamber beneath the confessional area had been transformed into an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation. The walls were lined with metal tubes drawing sound down from the confessionals above, and a sophisticated network of curved metal reflectors amplified conversations to startling clarity. But the most damning discoveries were the hundreds of coded documents filling several wooden cabinets, transcripts of confessions stretching back nearly 3 years, organized by parish and cross-referenced by the names of those who had confessed. Isabella spent several hours examining these documents, her horror mounting as she grasped the true scope of the Thornton network's activities. The files contained not only confession transcripts but also detailed profiles of victims, records of blackmail payments, and correspondence among the 3 Thornton priests discussing the expansion of their operation to additional parishes throughout Maryland and into Virginia. One file, marked with symbols she couldn't immediately identify, appeared to contain a list of parishioners who had become problematic for the network. Isabella's blood ran cold as she realized that several individuals on that list had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years, deaths attributed to natural causes, but which the coded documents suggested might have been something else entirely. The most disturbing discovery, however, was a detailed plan for what the Thorntons called their final solution, a systematic expansion of their blackmail network that would eventually envelop every Catholic parish in the Chesapeake region, creating a criminal enterprise capable of dominating the economic and political life of the entire colony. As Isabella carefully copied key documents using a camera obscura technique she had learned through her scientific studies, she heard sounds from the main floor of the church that turned her blood to ice. Father Thornton had returned early from the retreat, and she could hear his footsteps moving with purpose toward the basement stairs. Isabella barely had time to extinguish her candle and conceal herself behind one of the filing cabinets before Father Thornton entered the chamber. Through a gap between the cabinets, she watched as the priest moved with the ease of long familiarity, checking the recording tubes and reviewing recent transcript files. But then he did something that confirmed Isabella's worst fears about the network's methods. From a locked drawer in one of the cabinets, Father Thornton withdrew a small glass vial containing a white powder. Isabella watched in horror as he carefully measured a portion into a separate container, then sealed both vials and returned them to their hiding place. Even in the dim candlelight, Isabella recognized the substance from her studies of chemistry and medicine: arsenic, the poison that had come to be known as inheritance powder for its efficiency in removing inconvenient relatives. Father Thornton spent nearly an hour in the basement chamber, reviewing files and making entries in his coded journal. When he finally departed, locking the chamber door behind him, Isabella remained concealed for another hour before daring to emerge. Her investigation had not merely confirmed the existence of the blackmail network, it had exposed something far more sinister. The Thorntons were prepared to kill to protect their criminal enterprise. The following morning, Isabella retrieved her letters and added additional pages documenting her discoveries in the basement, including a detailed account of the poison she had watched Father Thornton handle. She then faced a terrible choice: wait to gather further evidence that might secure the Thorntons' conviction, or trigger the investigation immediately to prevent additional murders. The decision was made for her when she learned that Richard Whitmore had fallen violently ill after receiving communion at Sunday Mass, displaying symptoms that precisely matched arsenic poisoning. As Whitmore lay dying in his home, attended by a physician who attributed his condition to a sudden fever of unknown origin, Isabella understood that the Thornton network had begun eliminating witnesses who might endanger their operation. She had fewer than 24 hours to expose the conspiracy before more victims joined Whitmore in the grave. But the Thorntons had been operating their network for nearly 3 years, and they had contingency plans that Isabella was only beginning to comprehend. When she woke the following morning to find 2 men watching her house from across the street, she realized that her own life was now in immediate danger. The final confrontation between Isabella Ashford and the Thornton network would test not only her courage and intelligence, but also her willingness to sacrifice everything, including her own life, to prevent a criminal conspiracy from seizing complete control over colonial Maryland's Catholic population. The morning of March 15, 1737 broke gray and cold over Havenwood, with fog rolling in off the Chesapeake Bay that seemed to muffle all sound and blur the line between earth and sky. Isabella Ashford stood at her bedroom window, watching the 2 men who had kept vigil outside her house through the night, their breath fogging in the cold air as they feigned casual conversation while never taking their eyes from the Ashford residence. Richard Whitmore had died in the night, his final hours defined by the agonizing symptoms of arsenic poisoning that the local physician, Dr. Benjamin Crawford, had misdiagnosed as putrid fever. Isabella knew that Whitmore's death was both a message and a declaration of war. The Thorntons were prepared to kill anyone who threatened their operation, and she would be next, unless she acted at once. But Isabella had used the sleepless night to prepare for this confrontation, devising a plan that would either dismantle the Thornton network or broadcast their crimes so publicly that even their deaths couldn't silence the truth. The key lay in exploiting the single vulnerability she had identified in their operation, their arrogance and their absolute certainty that colonial society would never credit accusations made by a young woman against respected priests. At 8 o'clock that morning, Isabella walked calmly out of her house and directly toward the 2 men who had been watching her. Their surprise at her boldness bought her the few seconds she needed to speak before they could react. "Please inform Father Thornton that Miss Ashford requests an immediate meeting to discuss her recent spiritual concerns," she said, her voice deliberate and loud enough to carry to several neighbors beginning their morning routines. "Tell him that I possess certain documents I believe will be of great interest to him, and that I am prepared to discuss terms for their return." The men exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by this unexpected turn. After a brief whispered exchange, one headed off toward St. Bartholomew while the other maintained his watch on Isabella. Father Thornton's response arrived within the hour. He would meet with Isabella at 2 o'clock that afternoon in the church sanctuary, ostensibly to provide spiritual counsel regarding her grief over Richard Whitmore's passing. The location suited Isabella's purposes perfectly. The sanctuary's superb acoustics would ensure that her exchange with Father Thornton could be heard clearly by witnesses she had stationed throughout the church. Those witnesses included her cousin Thomas Ashford, the magistrate from Annapolis, who had arrived that morning in response to Isabella's urgent summons. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, still puzzled by the unusual symptoms he had observed in Richard Whitmore. And Margaret Whitmore, who had agreed to assist Isabella despite her own grief, because she harbored her own suspicions that her husband's death was connected to his mysterious monthly payments to the church. But Isabella's most crucial witness was Bishop Carroll himself, who had traveled from Baltimore after receiving her detailed letter about the Thornton network. The bishop had initially been skeptical of accusations leveled against 3 of his priests, but Isabella's evidence had been compelling enough to warrant a personal investigation. At precisely 2 o'clock, Isabella entered St. Bartholomew's sanctuary to find Father Thornton waiting at the altar. His usual benevolent expression had been replaced by something cold and predatory. The afternoon light filtering through the church's plain windows cast long shadows across the pews, lending the space an atmosphere more suited to a tribunal than a spiritual counseling session. "Miss Ashford," Father Thornton began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I understand you have some concerns regarding certain church matters you'd like to address." Indeed I do, Father, Isabella replied, positioning herself so that her voice would project to the concealed witnesses. I have discovered that you and your nephews have been running a criminal conspiracy that violates the sacred seal of confession and uses religious authority to commit extortion and murder. Father Thornton's veneer of priestly concern fell away entirely, revealing the calculating criminal beneath. Those are very serious accusations, Miss Ashford. I trust you have substantial evidence to support such claims. I have transcripts of recorded confessions from your basement chamber, Isabella replied, producing a folder of documents. I have coded correspondence between you and your nephews discussing blackmail payments and the planned expansion of your network to 16 additional parishes. And I have witnessed you personally handling arsenic in the same basement where Richard Whitmore's confession was recorded, the same Richard Whitmore who died last night displaying symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Father Thornton's eyes narrowed as he grasped the extent of Isabella's knowledge. Miss Ashford, you have stumbled into matters far beyond your comprehension. The work we do serves a higher purpose than your simple mind can appreciate. Then enlighten me, Father, Isabella said, her voice unwavering despite the danger she knew she was facing. Explain to me how blackmailing your parishioners and poisoning those who threaten to expose you advances God's purpose. Father Thornton stepped closer, his imposing height casting a shadow over Isabella. The Catholic Church in Maryland exists at the tolerance of Protestant authorities who would destroy us at the first opportunity. We have built a system that guarantees the survival and prosperity of our faith by securing the loyalty of our most influential members. Those who contribute generously to our cause receive our protection. Those who threaten our mission face the consequences of their betrayal. You mean those who refuse to pay your extortion demands are murdered? Isabella said bluntly. I mean that God works through his servants in mysterious ways, Father Thornton replied. Richard Whitmore had become unreliable. He was beginning to ask questions, demanding to see how his charitable contributions were being used. He had become a threat to our entire operation. Isabella felt a chill spread through her as she realized that Father Thornton was essentially confessing to murder, apparently certain she would not survive to repeat his words. But what he didn't know was that every word was being absorbed by Bishop Carroll and the other witnesses concealed throughout the sanctuary. And what about me, Father? Isabella asked. Am I also a threat to your operation? Father Thornton's smile was genuinely terrifying. Miss Ashford, you are an unmarried young woman making hysterical accusations against respected priests. Who would give such claims any credence? Even if you were to make these allegations publicly, they would be dismissed as the delusions of a disturbed mind. But fortunately for both of us, that won't be necessary, because you are going to voluntarily withdraw these ridiculous accusations and destroy whatever evidence you believe you've gathered. Because you intend to kill me as well. Because you're going to see reason, Father Thornton said. We know about your nocturnal activities in our basement. We know you violated the sanctity of God's house to steal church documents. More to the point, we have witnesses who will swear they saw you at Richard Whitmore's home on the night he died. And we have evidence that you kept arsenic for your chemical experiments. Isabella felt the trap closing around her as she recognized the sophistication of the Thorntons' contingency planning. They had anticipated the possibility of exposure and prepared to frame her for Whitmore's murder. Even if you were to escape prosecution for murder, Father Thornton continued, the scandal would annihilate your family's reputation. Your father's business relationships would dissolve. Your engagement to Jonathan Pierce would be ended. Your family would be shunned by decent society. All of this can be avoided if you simply acknowledge that your accusations were the product of feminine hysteria and emotional distress following Whitmore's death. And if I refuse? Father Thornton's expression shifted to something that resembled genuine sorrow, as though he regretted what he was about to say. Then I'm afraid you will be found in your room tomorrow morning, having taken your own life in remorse for falsely accusing innocent priests and for your guilt over murdering poor Richard Whitmore. Suicide is a mortal sin, of course, but God is merciful to those whose minds have been disturbed by their own wickedness. Isabella recognized this as the moment of ultimate reckoning, not merely a test of her courage, but of her faith in justice and her willingness to sacrifice herself to prevent a greater evil. Father Thornton had laid bare the full extent of his network's corruption and his readiness to commit murder, but only because he was certain she would never live to expose him. You've made one critical error, Father Thornton, Isabella said, her voice ringing clear through the sanctuary. You assumed I came here alone and unprepared. She raised her voice to address the hidden witnesses. Bishop Carroll, Magistrate Ashford, Dr. Crawford, I trust you've heard enough to understand the nature of the conspiracy before us." The color drained from Father Thornton's face as Bishop Carroll stepped out from behind the altar, followed by Thomas Ashford and the other witnesses. The priest's eyes darted toward the sanctuary doors, but his escape was blocked by several armed men Magistrate Ashford had positioned outside the church. "Thomas Thornton," Bishop Carroll declared, his voice weighted with both authority and disgust, "by the power vested in me by the Holy Catholic Church, I hereby strip you of your priesthood and excommunicate you for crimes against the faithful. Magistrate Ashford, this man is now in your custody." But Father Thornton's surrender was not as complete as it appeared. As Thomas Ashford stepped forward with shackles, the defrocked priest suddenly lunged toward a cabinet near the altar, where Isabella realized he must have concealed a weapon. The sound of the pistol shot reverberated through St. Bartholomew's sanctuary like a thunderclap, followed by a silence so complete that Isabella could hear her own heartbeat. Father Thornton lay motionless on the floor before the altar, the small knife he had drawn from the cabinet glinting in the afternoon light beside his outstretched hand. Magistrate Ashford lowered his smoking pistol, his face grim as he looked upon the body. "He chose his own judgment," the magistrate said quietly. "God help his soul." The investigation that followed Father Thornton's death revealed the full dimensions of the criminal conspiracy that had operated under the cover of religious authority for nearly 4 years. When Magistrate Ashford's men searched the basement chambers beneath St. Bartholomew, St. Michael's, and St. Joseph's, they uncovered extensive evidence of the blackmail network that had systematically exploited the sacred trust of confession to extort money from hundreds of victims. The coded documents recovered from the 3 churches painted a portrait of criminal organization that rivaled anything colonial law enforcement had ever encountered. The Thornton network had compiled detailed intelligence on over 2,000 families across Maryland, maintaining files that cataloged their business dealings, personal relationships, financial vulnerabilities, and most intimate secrets. The scope of their operation had stretched far beyond simple extortion to include systematic tax evasion, customs fraud, and what appeared to be at least 7 murders disguised as natural deaths. Marcus and Samuel Thornton were arrested at their respective parishes while attempting to destroy evidence of their involvement. Both men initially protested ignorance of their uncle's criminal activities, insisting they had believed themselves to be participating in legitimate church intelligence gathering designed to better serve their parishioners spiritually. But the coded correspondence recovered from their churches told a different story entirely, revealing their active role in planning blackmail operations and their awareness of the murders committed to shield the network. The trials of the Thornton nephews became a sensation throughout colonial Maryland, drawing observers from as far away as Philadelphia and Charleston. The proceedings exposed not only the mechanics of the blackmail operation but also the degree to which the network had penetrated colonial society. Testimony from victims revealed that the Thorntons had systematically targeted the wealthiest and most powerful Catholic families in the region, using their confessions to manipulate everything from business arrangements to political appointments. Dr. Benjamin Crawford's testimony proved particularly devastating when he disclosed that he had treated 4 other patients over the preceding 2 years who had exhibited symptoms nearly identical to Richard Whitmore's final illness. All 4 had been regular contributors to their parish churches, and all had died following what their families described as periods of heightened anxiety about their spiritual well-being. Exhumation and examination of these bodies revealed arsenic concentrations confirming they had been systematically poisoned. The psychological impact on Maryland's Catholic community was devastating. The revelation that 3 priests had shattered the sacred seal of confession to commit extortion and murder destroyed the trust binding the religious community together. Many families stopped attending Mass entirely, while others demanded that Bishop Carroll introduce new safeguards to prevent similar abuses of religious authority. The economic consequences were equally severe. The Thornton network's blackmail operation had generated an estimated £12,000 over 4 years, a fortune by colonial standards, much of which had been channeled into property and investments throughout the Chesapeake region. The recovery and redistribution of these ill-gotten gains became a complex legal process that continued for nearly a decade after the trials concluded. Isabella Ashford's role in exposing the conspiracy made her both a celebrated and a contentious figure. While many praised her courage and intellect in dismantling the network, others criticized her for violating the sanctity of church property and questioned whether a young woman should have involved herself in such perilous affairs. The debate over Isabella's conduct reflected deeper tensions in colonial society regarding women's proper roles and the relationship between individual conscience and religious authority. The long-term consequences of the Thornton affair reached well beyond Maryland's Catholic community. The scandal fed growing Protestant suspicions about Catholic loyalty and supplied ammunition to those who argued that Catholics could not be trusted in positions of authority within colonial society. These tensions would persist deep into the Revolutionary period and beyond, shaping debates about religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Bishop Carroll implemented sweeping reforms to prevent similar abuses, including mandatory inspections of all church construction projects, regular rotation of priests between parishes, and new procedures for overseeing church finances. But the deeper question of how to guard against the abuse of religious authority while preserving the efficacy of pastoral care remained unresolved. The physical modifications the Thorntons had made to their churches were torn out, but the buildings continued in use, standing as permanent reminders of the corruption that had once operated within their walls. St. Bartholomew continued to serve the Havenwood community, though many parishioners reported discomfort during confession for years following the scandal. Marcus Thornton was executed in the spring of 1738, having been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of extortion. Samuel Thornton received a life sentence in recognition of his younger age and apparently lesser role in planning the murders, though he died in prison less than 2 years later under circumstances that some observers found troubling. The broader implications of the Thornton conspiracy continued to reverberate through colonial American society for decades after the trials ended. The case became a reference point for discussions about religious freedom, clerical accountability, and the proper relationship between church and state. Legal scholars invoked the Thornton precedent in debates about the limits of religious privilege and the conditions under which secular authorities could intervene in church affairs. Isabella Ashford married Jonathan Pierce as planned, though the wedding was postponed nearly a year while the trials ran their course. She never spoke publicly about her role in exposing the conspiracy, but private letters discovered after her death in 1782 revealed that she continued to wrestle with the psychological weight of her confrontation with the Thorntons. In one letter to her cousin written in 1745, she reflected on the cost of justice. "Sometimes I wonder whether the truth was worth the lives it took and the faith it shattered. But then I recall Richard Whitmore's final agony, and I know that some evils must be confronted regardless of the consequences." The story of the Thornton family's criminal conspiracy stands as a reminder that corruption can take root even within the institutions a society holds most sacred, and that the price of justice falls most heavily on those with the courage to speak truth to power. In the tobacco fields of colonial Maryland, beneath the shadow of St. Bartholomew's Bell Tower, the legacy of that courage endures as a testament to the conviction that no authority, religious or secular, stands beyond accountability when it betrays the trust of those it claims to serve. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Thornton affair is not what was uncovered, but what remains concealed. The coded documents recovered from the 3 churches referenced other networks operating in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, suggesting that the Maryland conspiracy was merely one branch of a far larger criminal enterprise that may have extended across colonial America. Despite exhaustive investigations, these other networks were never identified, leaving historians to wonder how many other secrets lie entombed beneath the foundations of America's oldest churches. The final entry in Father Thomas Thornton's coded journal, discovered months after his death, when investigators finally cracked his encryption, contained a single chilling line: "The harvest is vast, but the workers are few. Others will continue what we have begun." Whether this was merely the bitter boast of a dying criminal or a reference to accomplices who slipped through justice's net remains one of colonial America's most unsettling unsolved questions. What do you make of this story? Do you believe everything was brought to light, or do you think secrets still lie buried beneath the foundations of America's oldest churches? Share your thoughts about the Thornton conspiracy in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of colonial history and want more stories that drag the hidden horrors of our nation's past into the light, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. The shadows of the past hold countless secrets, and we're only just beginning to uncover them. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten horror that time tried to bury.